Okay, good morning. We are on Kuf Hey Yomid Beis 105b. We left off with a distinction between Havdalah and Kiddush. Although, as we're going to learn soon, at the root, Havdalah and Kiddush are the same obligation, are the same mitzvah. We had it already before, mentioned briefly, but essentially it comes down to declaring the sanctity of the day and distinguishing it from other days. That's essentially what it is, both Kiddush and Havdalah.
Right.
But yet, we're learning, this is the last thing we discussed, that there's a difference in that Kiddush, one wants to make that declaration as early as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
That way it demonstrates your excitement over Shabbos, which is why, although there is an opinion which says that if you're eating a meal Friday afternoon, you can continue going and then make Kiddush when you're done, that's not the halacha. The halacha is, as soon as Shabbos hits, even if you're in the middle of a meal, you stop and make Kiddush. As we're going to learn later, the details of that halacha. But that's the principle. Because as soon as you have the opportunity to make Kiddush, as soon as Shabbos is there, you enthusiastically declare its holiness with your Kiddush. When it comes to Havdalah, on the other hand, depending on the circumstance, you can extend your Shabbos. Although there's a principle that as soon as you have an obligation, you ought to fulfill it. But nonetheless, if one was, for example, began a meal early enough in Shabbos day, and then use that meal to extend their Shabbos, good, extend your Shabbos. Right? Why not? And this came down to a Mishnaic text, which stated the following scenario, from which we're going to derive 8 laws. And then those 8 laws will be broken down over the next 2 or 3 pages. And that's going to become the springboard for the various different halachic analysis we're going to do from the Shulchan Aruch. So the scenario was, a person comes home from shul. This is the description. Man comes home from shul, and he wants to make Havdalah, and he also wants to eat a meal. Eating a meal means he's going to wash. That's the old day. He would eat staple food, bread. So has to make Havdalah. It's Saturday night. And he wants to eat a meal. But he only has one he only has 1 cup of wine. So now he has 2 obligations in front of him over that one and over a cup of wine. The first, this is Havdalah, to be declared recited holding a cup of wine, as well as his benching to be recited over a cup of wine. Yeah, there's an opinion that says he should do that all the time. That's going to be one of the laws derived from this text. Although as we learned in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not our opinion. It's not our practice, but there is such a thing where there are those who every single time they bench, pick up a cup of wine, every time. Just like Kiddush.
There's nobody else around there.
It's irrelevant. Just like Kiddush, whether you're alone or other people around you, you hold a cup of wine and you make Kiddush. So likewise, you hold a cup of wine for a Birkat HaMazon. Yeah. It's holding a cup of wine over the recitation of a blessing is your way of demonstrating your honor you're bestowing upon that blessing, like we do by a bris, like we do by a wedding, and we do Kiddush, Havdalah, and Birkat HaMazon, at least in this opinion. Okay, so he's got 1 cup of wine and he has to eat a meal, which is going to conclude with benching, over which he wants to hold a cup of wine, or should, according to this opinion, and he has to make Havdalah. So the halachas, this Mishnaic text stated, he should eat his meal before Havdalah, right? Because he has 1 cup of wine. And then at the end of his meal, he picks up that cup of wine and does benching and Havdalah over 1 cup of wine, which would mean, this is the way the Gemara put it, he would hold a cup of wine, right? Make Birchas HaMazon, then make the bracha hagafen, then, in this Mishnaic text opinion, make the bracha over the candle, then make the bracha over B'samim, then make Havdalah, and then drink the wine. So he's holding it for quite a while. Picks it up, he holds it for his Birchas HaMazon, keeps on holding it, makes hagafen, in this opinion, candle, then B'samim, and then Havdalah. We do B'samim first. But in this Mishnaic text opinion, we're going to discuss this, the Ma'or comes first. This was the scenario. So you're already picking up on some halachas that this Mishnah is telling us that are relevant to all Havdalah. And that's what the Gemara is going to do now. So, tell us 8 different halachas we can derive from this scenario described. Yeah, what do you want to say?
This is someone who was started his meal before the end.
No,
Right?
no. That's a good point. Because the Mishnah text opens up with a man who comes home Saturday night. And he wants to eat a meal, and he wants to
eat until you make up the law.
But in this case, he may.
This is a big exception.
That's right. It's a big exception to the rule, considering that he wants to bench with a cup of wine. And that overrides
Hang on a second.
the prohibition to eat before Havdalah. That's a good point, yeah?
So he washed for this, and then
He washes, sits down, has his meal, and when he's done, he picks up that one singular cup of wine he has in the house. Correct? That's your point. This is a big exception to the rule because he wants to bench with a cup of wine that overrode. That's right.
And you're introducing this one.
That's right. That's right. So it seems as though, so long as your meal is eaten with the permission of halacha, you can use it to extend your Shabbos. But over here in this case, as we'll see in a minute, not necessarily the Shabbos. His Shabbos is over already. Because as we'll learn, considering that the Mishnah opens up with he came home, implying he already done Ma'ariv, and that's what we're about to learn. But nonetheless, it's still a big leniency he's being allowed to eat, which is going to come up as well. So these are all very correct and important things we're pointing out, and the Gemara is going to discuss them all.
Probably tied into the fact that he's already said Havdalah in his prayer.
Perhaps, but maybe not. Let's see. So let's go through it because we're going to break it all down. But yes, these are all correct points. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom of the page of Kufhei Amud Beis, 105b. It's 1, 2, 3, 4th word. Shema mina miha. In any event, we can derive from here, Masnisan, from this Mishnah text. Tamni, we can derive 8 different laws from this text and this scenario. Number 1. Shema mina, we derive from here, Hamavdil betfila, one who already declares Havdalah, already declares the distinction between Shabbos and the weekday in his davening. Sarich sheyavdal hakois, he's required to again make Havdalah at home, holding a cup of wine. We know this because we just read. The scenario is the man came home Saturday night.
Right.
Presumably, he came home from a shul, and in shul he davened Ma'ariv. And in Ma'ariv, as he's supposed to, he made Havdalah in Ma'ariv, not the Chanatanu, right? He made that declaration separating with Shabbos and Yom Tov, and yet we're told he has to make Havdalah on wine and combine it with his benching or so on. Mm-hmm. Here, take the key and open the office door. You'll see right on the left. No problem. So that's derivation number 1. That even though he made Havdalah in his davening, he has to again make Havdalah while holding a cup of wine. Number 1. Number 2, Shema mina, we can derive from here, right? And this remains halach, obviously. Shema mina, we can learn from here, bracha to an hakois. We learn from here as well that when a person does birchat hamazon, he requires to hold a cup of wine, because he's told to violate the prohibition of eating before Havdalah, so that he can hold that cup of wine to make a bracha on to do birchat hamazon on a cup of wine. So clearly, in the opinion of this text, one is required to hold a cup of wine for benching. Right? In this text, at least. It's not the halacha. Again, there's 2 opinions in halacha, and we go with the other one. But there is this valid opinion in halacha that every single time a person is birchat hamazon, he has to hold a cup of wine, and that's derived from this text. Right? Because he's told, delay your Havdalah so that you can do birchat hamazon with that 1 cup of wine you have. That's number 2. Shema mina, we also derive from here, number 3. Koi shel bracha tzarich shir. That when a person makes a bracha over a cup of wine, that cup of wine must have the minimum measurement of a revius. How do we derive that from this scenario? Because if you're allowed to get away with less, and divide your cup into 2, 1 for Havdalah and 1 for birchat hamazon. You're being told here that because you only have 1 cup of wine, delay it to the end of the meal and combine your Havdalah and your birchat hamazon over 1 cup. But if you're allowed to have less than the minimum measure, then whatever you have, divide it in 2. You can't divide it in 2 because when you make a bracha over a cup of wine, there has to be a minimum measure of the revius. Okay, so halacha number 3 we derive. Halacha number 4, Shema, we know we can also derive hamavarich tzarich sheyitin. One who makes a blessing over a cup of wine must drink from the wine, either him or someone else. But someone's got to drink from that. How do we derive from that from here? Because in theory, if you didn't have to drink every time you hold a cup of wine for Havdalah or for any bracha, then what should have be done? Picked up the cup of wine, made Havdalah, put it down, leave it there, eat his meal, come to benching, pick up the same cup of wine, and then make up bracha tamazon. But he's told, no, you got to combine your Havdalah and your bracha tamazon at the end. Why? Because you're going to be drinking from some of it. And once you drink, it loses its measure, and you can't use it again. Moreover, that's number 4. Halacha number 5. Shema, we know we derive from here. Ta'amoi POGUM. Ta'amoi POGUM. When a person drinks in a cup of wine, he has invalidated the rest of the wine.
You what?
Has invalidated the rest of the wine. POGUM means he defected it. It's an expression here a lot.
So you can't tell other people.
On that cup, that's correct. So, or any other bracha over a cup. Now, there's always one understand this as like a spiritual type thing. You drank from the wine and you like defiled it and you can't use it again. Perhaps, but on a more basic level, you could just imagine it as
It's not complete.
you want to give it honor by giving it a fresh cup of wine. When you're drinking leftovers, it's like you're
Recycling.
recycling. You're being disrespectful to this brach. You're trying to raise a cup of wine to give that blessing honor, to give the kiddush honor, to give the Havdalah honor, to give the Tamazon honor, whatever the cup, and here you're taking leftovers. Right. So which is why it's very simple to undo the POGUM by adding some more wine or by it's very easy to by turning it into fresh wine again, by making it into a fresh cup. Like you pour it into another cup and just add a little bit more wine from a fresh bottle, and that way you're like refreshenizing it, so to speak. But the point is that you're pouring yourself a fresh cup of wine for this blessing, as opposed to just taking leftovers. So now we learn from here that leftovers is no good. Because if leftovers was allowed, again, make your Havdalah at the beginning, drink a little bit, and use your leftovers for bracha tamazon.
Could have added on.
He doesn't have any extra wine.
Right.
He only, right?
Maybe you can learn out from here too that you can add other.
Here.
Then it would have said so. Didn't say anything about it. But actually,
But you can.
we don't know what else he has in his home. We just know he only has one cup of wine. But
No, but
at any rate, the halacha is you're supposed to have a cup of wine. Yeah. Okay, so now we derive as well that when you drink a cup of wine, you've invalidated it for another unique bracha. Because otherwise you would be allowed to make Havdalah at the beginning, drink a little bit, and then use the rest for Havdalah. Yeah.
Spills over, Now you didn't drink the entire bit. Right?
Yeah.
Take that wine and pour it back.
Sure.
But it's POGUM.
So again, what does POGUM mean?
Means you defiled it.
No.
That's
That's what I'm just explaining now.
Exactly. But I mean,
It doesn't make the wine not kosher. It's not a spiritual
Right.
defilement. It's disrespectful to the mitzvah not to pour yourself a fresh cup of wine for it.
Right. But now that you pour it back.
Finished. Now the next time you fill it up, you're pouring a fresh cup of wine. That's the point here. As long as you're pouring a fresh cup of wine for your bracha, there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, it's only a fresh cup of wine because it's been diluted by the rest of the bottle.
Because it's back because you're pouring it freshly. You're not just picking up a leftover cup.
Pouring it freshly.
That's the main point here. Which is why if you added some more wine, it would make it not POGUM anymore. Because again, the point of POGUM.
In other words, if you pour the wine, another piece of bottle, that extra bottle, into that cup.
Now you're pouring a fresh cup and you're giving it its due. That's correct. That's the whole point here. The point of this POGUM thing is it's become like this association with like defilement. Nothing to do. It just means it's not you're disrespecting the mitzvah by taking a leftover cup of wine for the mitzvah. But by making a fresh bought cup, good. Whether someone drank from before or not drank from before is irrelevant. The point is it's a fresh cup of wine you're pouring for the mitzvah.
The whole thing, years ago,
Yeah.
You made kiddush, right? And then the person making kiddush drinks the wine and gives his wife.
Oh.
I learned much later on that it's POGUM.
That's correct.
I pour the wine for her, and then I drink.
That's the more correct way of doing it.
Or for whoever at the table.
That's the more correct way of doing it. That's right.
Yes, there you go.
Well, it's not an absolute, but there is such a thing. I don't want to go down this route, but there is such a thing, because if you, let's back up a second.
Yeah.
I don't want to take too much time on this, but just very briefly, just to understand this. When you make kiddush and someone else listens, they don't have to drink from the wine. No, they just say amen and they fulfill their obligation. Yeah. which means once they did that, you can give them leftover cup of wine from your cup after you've drunk, and it's no problem. And they're just drinking a little bit from the kois shel bracha. Kois shel bracha meaning the cup over which the blessing was declared, whether the blessing is brech namazim, whether the blessing is avdallah, whether the blessing is kiddush, whatever. You're giving them from the kois shel bracha, right? You know, the would give out kois shel bracha from his avdallah, right? Avdallah, you certainly, no one's drinking from the cup of wine. We don't do that. Yet the Rebbe was still giving people from his cup of wine, and it was after he drank from it.
How is he filling it?
He would hold his cup of wine, and there was someone next to him, and keep on refilling his cup to give everybody.
Refilling his cup.
Yeah, he never made sure that there was always still some wine left from his original, and that way everybody was drinking from the kosher bracha. They were drinking from the cup over which the Rebbe made the bracha. Finished. Yeah.
But that's unrelated to the actual Havdalah.
Exactly. So long as you answer Amen, that's right. Exactly. That's right. The point is, you're drinking from a cup of wine over which a bracha was made. Good. So that's good. But there is a bonus feature here, is that if you did what you just described, which is what I do, by the way, before I drink from my Kiddush cup, I pour a little bit out into a cup for my wife to drink. Before I drink a little bit.
How is it not POGUM?
Because I didn't drink from it yet. Because she's still drinking the fresh cup. And that's the added virtue here.
It's not full anymore.
The lack of full is not a problem, because while I was holding the bracha, it was full. You just have to make sure that there's still a revius left in your cup. For the person, for you who made the kiddush,
Worst case scenario, you can pour in your own wine.
Better not. You want to drink from the cup you want to drink from the cup you made kiddush, from what you made kiddush over. But if you give your wife first, then she's also drinking the fresh wine.
Right.
So again, POGUM is the opposite of fresh. Let's think of it that way. And once you drink from it, it's no longer fresh. No longer has that feature of like fresh wine for the mitzvah. So if you give your wife before you drink, she's also enjoying of the fresh wine from the mitzvah and not your leftovers. So there's that added feature. If it's I did listen to one shir from Rabbi Ashkenazi in Eretz Yisrael. He says it's required to do this. I'm not so convinced, but he's much smarter than me, so I'll take his word for it.
Right.
Although, and others I saw will pour a little bit of wine into cups before they make kiddush.
Right.
And that way, like the kiddush they're making is extending to all the cups of wine. Maybe. But again, these are all added bonuses, because as far as the essential kiddush goes, as long as everybody answered, good to go. That's it. Yeah? Okay. So again, this scenario taught us already how many halachas we covered so far. Number one, that even though you made Havdalah in your Ma'ariv, in your prayer, you still have to make Havdalah in a cup. Number one, we learned. Number two, Birchat HaMazon, in the opinion of this Mishnaic text, requires a cup of wine. Number three, when you make a bracha over a cup of wine, you have to drink from that cup of wine. Because otherwise, if you don't have to drink from it, then you can make the Havdalah at the beginning, put the cup down, make Birchat HaMazon at the end, at the same cup of wine, you're good to go. Can't do that because you have to drink from the first one. Number three. Number four, we learned that, that was number five. That was number four. Before that was, the cup of wine requires a minimum amount. Otherwise, you would be told to split it in two. First, make Havdalah on half the cup, and then Birchat HaMazon on the other half. From the fact that you're told to combine all together implies that you have to have a full cup of wine every time you make the bracha over it. Yeah. Then we also learned that anyone who makes a bracha over a cup of wine, you can drink some. That was number four. Number five, ta'amoi pagmoi. When you drink some, it's now become no longer fresh, and you cannot reuse it for another bracha. And therefore, if you made Havdalah at the beginning of your meal, you couldn't use the rest of that wine for Havdalah at the end, for Birchat HaMazon at the end, which is why you're being told to combine your Havdalah and Birchat HaMazon at the end together. Yeah, that was number five. Number six, Shema Mina. Sorry?
We're still on the same page?
Yeah, last three words. Shema Mina, we also derive from here. Ta'am mabdil. This is the point you were making earlier. That even though you just finished eating, you can still make Havdalah. There's going to be an opinion, it's going to come up later, which says that Havdalah must precede your meal. And therefore, if you forgot to make Havdalah Saturday night and you ate, you can no longer make Havdalah now, according to that opinion, because you've already eaten. You've ruined your Havdalah. Wait till the next day when you're about to eat breakfast and make Havdalah before your breakfast. There is such an opinion. But this Mishnaic text obviously does not agree with that opinion, because this Mishnaic text says, eat your meal and Havdalah at the end, which means, Ta'am mabdil, even though you just finished eating, you can still make Havdalah. That's
irrelevant to when you started your meal.
So, right, we discussed that already, that it should be started properly. This is a case where it's Saturday night and he has only one cup of wine. and therefore he's given permissibility to eat before Havdalah, so that way he can use that 1 cup of wine for his Birkas Hamazon and his Havdalah together, which is the final halacha derived from here. Actually, 7th. Shema we know we derive from here, top of Kuf Vav Madal, top of 106a. Shema we know we derive from here. Oimer beis kedushas al kais echad. That if a person doesn't only has 1 cup of wine, he may combine 2 holy items on that 1 cup. In this case, Havdalah and Birkas Hamazon. And finally, Shema we know we learn from here. This is to the point of the most by the by, like the most what's the word? Incidental. The most side point is that the opinion of this Mishnah text follows Beis Shammai alibud Rabbi Yehuda. It follows a specific strain of an opinion of Beis Shammai as the way Rabbi Yehuda presented it, namely that the bracha over the candle comes before Besamim, because Beis Hillel is of the view that Besamim comes before the candle. We had this earlier, a dispute when on a regular Saturday night, which one comes first, the Besamim or the candle? We do Besamim first and candle second. But this Mishnah text said to do a candle first. So obviously, this Mishnah text follows Rabbi Yehuda as he presents Beis Shammai, which is not the halach. Which is why it's the most incidental, so to speak, because it just tells us who the opinion of the speaker here is. It doesn't tell us any actual halacha for us to derive, because we are not of that opinion anyway. We don't follow that opinion anyway. Okay? We're clear so far? Okay. Ravashi. Okay, this is the end of the Gemara's analysis, telling us that there's 8 things to be derived from that scenario described in that Mishnah. Ravashi says, actually, you should combine 2 of these. 2 of these 8 can be combined. Namely, this fact that Talmud Pesachim, the fact that the tasting it invalidates the rest of the cup because it's no longer fresh, is directly related to the fact that Koishal Bracha Sarach Shir, that Koishal Bracha requires a minimum amount. Think about it. He's old.
POGUM you need to add.
He doesn't have anything to add, right?
Right.
So he's 1 cup of wine, and it's exactly a revius, which is why he's not splitting it in half. So you taste it a little bit, it's now not fresh. Well, it's also less than a revius. So they're actually linked. Chada milsi, it's 1 item. And therefore, what does Ravashi derive from this analysis then? We don't follow this halachically speaking. But what he derives from this is, here's what it means to say. My tama pogmoi. Why is it that when you taste something, it's no longer considered fresh and therefore no longer allowed to be reused? Mishum de kosher bracha tzarashir, because the cup of wine requires a minimum amount, and that's why it's no longer fresh. Which means in Rashi's view, if your cup of wine had more than the correct amount, and you drank a little bit, it would still be fresh because you have a fresh revius.
Then you wouldn't combine those 2; they would be separated.
Well, in this case, the person only has 1 cup of wine, right? If he only has 1 cup of wine, he has only a revius. He only has the minimum amount, which means once he drank from it, it's A, no longer fresh, because B, he doesn't have enough. Which means if I did have enough left over, it would be considered still fresh.
You can have a bit
And
more, but
still
it
not
won't be 2
have
of
enough for
these.
2 cups.
Sorry?
It won't be
You'd
2
still
of
have
these.
a little bit more.
So that's how we would disagree with Ravashi. As we're going to see that those disagree with Ravashi. But this is Ravashi's logic. I'm assuming this is the right way of learning. I'm sure there's other ways to learn, but this is my understanding of this little scenario here based on Rashbam's comment. Yeah, this is Rashbam's comment. Based on Rashbam's comment, I'm learning it this way. Namely, that Rav Ashi is of the view that the 2 are linked. The tasting of the wine actually Tosfos disagrees with Rashbam's learning. Seems because he doesn't have any argument. But Rashbam learns there's an argument. Okay, I can see where there's going to be discussion around this. But let's just learn the way Rashbam teaches us to learn. So Rav Ashi is saying, why is it that when you taste, you ruin the freshness of the rest of the cup? Because here the guy got a minimum and he doesn't have enough left. Which would mean, in this learning, that if you had enough left, it would still be considered a fresh cup because you have a fresh revius. That's a good seem like. One way to learn it. Although there's other ways to learn it, which would say, like you guys are saying, the guy has a revius and a half, let's say,
Yeah.
It's still not enough.
and it's still not enough to divide into two, and you have a separate issue called freshness.
Yeah.
So then what's Rav Ashi trying to point out? Rav Ashi is just trying to point out in that learn. In other words, if that's the case, then what's Rav Ashi trying to point out? What's trying to point out that the two are the same? They're not the same. What's Rav Ashi trying to point out? This is what compelled.
POGUM is only when you have exactly reveals.
Oh, so now you're back to Rashbam's point. That's it. In other words, we have to understand what's Rav Ashi thinking, right? So let's learn. Let's do this, a little yeshiva exercise. Let's learn the words of Rav Ashi directly without any commentary, and you tell me how you understand it. Okay? Rav Ashi says, "Talmud Pesachim, the fact that tasting it makes the rest of the wine not fresh, the koishal bracha tzorich shir, and the fact that a cup of a bracha requires the minimum amount, chada milsihi is really one thing. The two are the same thing. And this is what it means to say, my tama pagmai. Why is it that when you taste it, you've ruined the freshness? Because a cup of wine requires the minimum amount. What did Rav Ashi just say? What did Rav Ashi just say?
He said that
Why are they two
If
the
you
same
had
thing?
more
And why
than-
does
if you had more than a revius when you started, and
Yes.
you took out, and you're left with at least a revius.
so you see?
then
Let's
POGUM
go
doesn't-
through the whole thing. So you have more than a revius, right?
Right.
And you drank a little bit of wine.
When you still have a revius.
You still have a revius left.
Then there's no issue with
Just-
POGUM.
That's what Rashbam just said. Which means Rav Ashi is trying to tell us a new halacha, different opinion. That pogum only is when by drinking you've made it less than a revius. Otherwise, what does he mean to say that the two are the same? That's what Rashbam learns.
They understood what the same thing.
The Gemara told us two different halachas derived from the scenario. Halacha A is when you taste it, you made it not fresh anymore. Halacha B is that when you that you have to have at least a revius for each cup of wine because you can't split it into two. Rav Ashi is saying, oh, those two halachas are the same.
Because if you're
Because-
left with a revius,
because
then-
The reason why your tasting makes it not fresh because a cup of wine requires a revius.
you don't have.
End quote from Rav Ashi. Which means Rav Ashi is of the view that freshness is only an issue when you've drunken to the point where you've ruined the amount of revius you have. Which means in Rav Ashi's view, if you had a revius and a half and you drank a half a revius, left behind a revius,
You're okay.
you're still good to go. You didn't make it not fresh anymore, which is obviously not the way we learn.
But why would anyone even talk about that POGUM and not just say you need a minimum of revius for any kiddush and that's it?
Right,
Why even talk about the freshness?
Rav Ashi's, okay, good point.
Why even
Oh, so
taste it?
because the other way of learning is like this. Like you're saying, the guy's got a revius and a half. So it's not enough to split into two.
Right?
But when he drinks a little bit, he still ruined the rest of the cup, even though it's more than a revius,
Not if he has a revius left.
in Rav Ashi's view.
Ah,
But the other people don't have to agree with Rav Ashi here, right? And that's what it seems like. Rav Ashi is disagreeing with the previous reading. The previous reading was there's two separate issues. One is ruining the freshness, even if you have a revius and a half, and the other issue is you can't split that revius and a half into two.
That's-
But Rav Ashi is combining the two, telling us that the issue of freshness is only when you have exactly a revius. It's only when you've drunk to the point that you left behind less than a revius, which again is not the halacha. As we'll learn in a moment, the halacha is even if you left behind more than a revius, because it's no longer fresh, it's no longer fresh. Even though you left behind more than a revius, as we'll learn in a second. Yeah, but you can see already how it's a little bit difficult to try to understand what Rav Ashi means and why Rashbam came to the conclusion that he's disagreeing. Even though Tosfos says it's not disagreeing. Only that Rav Ashi is arguing whether you can derive it from this scenario. He's not arguing the halacha, he's only arguing about whether you can derive it from this
Know whether
scenario.
He started with he only had a revius or only had a revius plus,
Exactly,
but less than two revius.
exactly. So because of that,
Can't derive out.
oh, so that's the other way of learning Rav Ashi. The other way of learning Rav Ashi is that he's not disagreeing with anybody. He agrees with the principle that if you drink a little bit, it's no longer fresh. He's just arguing that you can't derive it from this scenario. Not because he argues the principle of the halacha. But as we just learned, Rashbam learns that he is arguing with the principle of the halacha. That pogum is only when you drink enough that you've ruined your revius. So, see two different ways of learning Rav Ashi. At any rate, it's not really so relevant to the practical halacha because practically speaking, we rule that when you drink from a cup of wine, you made the rest not fresh, no matter how much left behind. In fact, even more, let's see. So Rav Yaakov bar Edi, so
Less.
again, I forgot the translation. I looked it up, but I forgot. Okay, Rav Yaakov bar Edi, Rav Yaakov, the son of Edi, One second, looking up Rabbi Steinfeld's translation. Oh, yeah, picture, that's what it is. Rav Yaakov Bar Idi, Rav Yaakov son of Idi. Kopid achitz v'pegima. He was particular about using a fresh pitcher, not just a fresh cup, but a fresh pitcher, which means he would only make a bracha over a cup of wine. Bracha not meaning hagafen, but a bracha of kiddush, Havdalah, Birkat Hamazon, something. If he was the first one to fill up the cup from that pitcher, he wanted to have not just a fresh cup, but a fresh pitcher. Not the halacha, but this was his opinion. And also, Rashbam points out, the word here used is kapit. He was particular, meaning to say it's not an absolute, but he would try to have a fresh pitcher. And if he didn't, okay, at least he would try. That was Rav Idi's practice. Rav Idi's son of, sorry, Yaakov son of Idi. Okay, it's a
fresh pitcher, a
fresh pitcher.
fresh pitcher.
Yes,
That sounds more than that.
more than much more. Rav Idi bar Shesha, Rav Idi son of Shisha, it's a gesund. Kopid was particular, akisa pegima, was particular about making sure he had a fresh cup. And Mar bar Rav Ashi, master, son of Rav Ashi, Kopid was particular, afilo v'chavisa pegima, even on a barrel, a fresh barrel. Now, is a fresh barrel bigger than the pitcher or smaller than the pitcher? So one could understand that it means bigger than the pitcher, but Rashbam learned that it means much smaller, actually.
But he covered
No worries. So just one second.
Larger than the rear.
Yeah.
Apparently maybe this barrel is smaller than
Rashbam says chaviyos katanos, small little pitchers, and not the big wooden pitchers that you store wine in. That would be way too much. Every single time you make kiddush and Havdalah, you have to open up a new barrel of wine. Who does that? Maybe there are people who do that. I don't know. But it seems like pitcher is the biggest concern. Cup of wine, the smallest, and a small miniature barrel, maybe what we would have, let's say, as a bottle, is the middle ground. But even so, we don't have a fresh bottle every time we make kiddush. Yeah.
Another example where
That's my question also. When you talked about, let's say, honoring the wine, so you can't have gam or whatever. Are you honoring the wine or are you honoring the kiddush?
You're honoring the kiddush by making a fresh cup. You're honoring the mitzvah that you're about to do, either kiddush, Havdalah, Birkat Hamazon, or the bracha.
You're at home, Shabbat, let's say, and you have wine that's like $100 a bottle that you have, and then you have wine that's $15 a bottle.
Are you required to open up the more expensive bottle of wine? It's a very good question.
You would. No, like what? I'm keeping the $100 for guests and not for Shabbat.
Well, guest is also a mitzvah.
Right.
Guest is also a mitzvah. It's a good question. Maybe tomorrow we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch here. We'll open up. There's a bunch of different halachas that the Gemara mentioned here. Some of which we'll cover when we get to the halachas of Kiddush and Havdalah. We'll cover a lot of that. Some of which we won't. So I'm going to look through this Kabbalah today, and tomorrow we'll select some relevant halachas about this. Maybe we'll look at the halachas of POGUM since it's interesting and discussed. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful day, Yidden. And tomorrow, God willing, we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch, because the next passage in the Gemara is actually in some ways the essence of the whole thing. It should like if you were writing a book about Kiddush, you would start with the next Gemara, which is the source from where we derive that you have to have a cup of wine, that you have to have a cup of wine when you make Kiddush B'chal. We've been discussing the law that you have to have a cup of wine, but from where, from what? Now we're going to learn where that comes from, which is like if you were writing, right? The Gemara is a conglomerate of conversation, so it just like goes from one to the next. Oh, you're mentioning Kiddush? Where do we derive, by the way, that you have to learn Kiddush? Oh, it comes from here, right? As opposed to if you're writing a book from beginning to end, you would start off with, okay, here's a source for Kiddush.
Very different.
It's a whole it's a conglomerate of conversations over centuries. So that's how it's derived. Okay, I'm willing. Tomorrow we'll look at some halacha and then continue the Gemara afterward. A wonderful day.
Yeah.
Thank you.